Okay, I'll begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Discuss a Paper right after reading it. Um, in um, in a session like this, we typically first pick a paper we want to read, and then we read it in 2 hours and then come back to discuss it. So today we have two people, me and then Yota, and I'll introduce myself first. My name is Qian Chen, and I'm a PhD student at Monash University.
Hey, me, Yota Kawashima. I'm research engineer in Japan.
Okay. So today we'll be reading a recent opinion paper by Westland et al., published in 2022 on Trends in Cognitive Sciences, titled Improving the Study of Brain Behavior Relationships by Revisiting Basic Assumptions. Now, I'll first give a brief summary of this paper, and then we will discuss contents of this paper. So in this paper, the authors start from like a general view of neuroscientific studies in brain and behavior relationships. Oftentimes in neuroscientific studies, if we want to study the neural underpinnings of a certain psychological event, such as some emotion, we first recruit a bunch of participants, we induce those events in them, record their neural activities, and see what neural mechanisms are activated to when that event occurs. And in these papers, surprisingly or non-surprisingly, instead of always finding some clean results, such as the same set of regions always respond to the same events, we found a lot of variance in both across participants and also between studies. And oftentimes, people regard these kind of variabilities as noise, some kind of small replication failures that can be disregarded because they come from confounds in the particular experiment design or the paradigm difference between studies, etc. However, the authors of this paper argue that these replication failures are no small feat. Rather, they come specifically from the basic assumptions that all these studies have been holding for a long time, and these assumptions could be wrong. According to the authors, there are three assumptions. The assumption of localization, the assumption of one-to-one mapping, and the assumption of independence. Now, I'll explain what each of the assumptions mean and what problems the authors identify from each. First of all, the assumption of localization. The definition of this is that we typically assume a particular psychological event is caused by a localized and restricted set of neural ensemble. Common examples for these include prefrontal cortex modulate our executive control. Fear is implicated in the amygdala, and visual processing is done by the visual cortices, something like this. And studies holding this assumption often attempt to single out, small regions that shows the strongest signal increase when the event occurs. And if there are weaker ones happening in the other areas of the brain, they just disregard it as noise. And in these studies, though, what they found was the raw data composed of weaker signals coming from the whole brain, plus some stronger signal in selective regions. If we hold this assumption, then only the small regions with the strongest increase will be selected as the neural underpinnings for that event. However, the author argues that if we look at the weaker signals of the whole brain, they tend to be significant themselves. And the authors argue that these are actually also important for contributing to the psychological event. In turn, if we look at the so-called dedicated mechanism we usually think are for a specific event, actually, they themselves contribute to other events as well, rather than just doing one job. For example, visual cortices, which we often think is just for processing visual information, can actually distinguish different types of auditory stimuli. So yeah, each region can multitask rather than having specific localized different mechanisms for each specific events. Therefore, the authors argue that psychological events are underpinned by activities in the whole brain rather than small isolated set of regions. The second assumption is one-to-one mapping. So after we kind of set aside the localization assumption, some may argue that, okay, each psychological event is underpinned by whole brain activities, right? What about the assumption that each psychological event is underpinned by a unique whole brain activity pattern? So when you switch from one event to another, you will see the whole brain network also changes accordingly. For the authors, even this is questionable because many recent evidence suggests that more than one brain network can produce the same function. For example, emotional experiences such as anger, fear, and disgust, each category of these experiences can be produced by many different whole brain networks rather than one network for one emotion. Therefore, in terms of the neuromechanism for psychological events, the authors argue that it is possible that multiple whole brain network can be mapped into the same event. Finally, we have the assumption of independence. So for this assumption, basically, it means that people assume neuromechanism for a psychological event operates and can be studied independently of other functions and the context of the whole brain and the body, stuff like that. For example, a typical study of a certain brain network to attention is like you have two conditions. One, you have people doing some tasks that require attention, and then the other one that does not require attention. And it's assumed that the mechanism for attention will be activated when you're doing the attentionally demanding task, and then will be inactivated when there's no attention. As simple as that. It's like a additive kind of relation. Each of these kind of psychological mechanisms, neural mechanism are like modules that and kind of independent thing that operates when duty calls. This assumption, according to the authors, is again questionable. And according to them, we need to consider the broader context from which a certain neural activity or network becomes activated. For example, we need to consider the influence of the states of the body to the brain, because many body states, such as heart rate, respiratory rates, quality of sleep, interacts with our brain signals. So when we observe certain neuromechanism in a participant under certain condition, it could emerge from deploying attention or deploying that particular psychological event of interest, and also the particular body states that the participants are in. So it might not be replicated in another participant. So overall, the authors argue that the psychological events emerge from a complex interaction between the brain and the body, rather than just some independent brain networks. To conclude, the authors argue that neuroscientific studies need to move forward with a new set of assumptions. First of all, rather than localized, restricted set of regions, psychological events may evolve from whole brain networks. Secondly, many rather than one brain networks are implicated in one psychological event. And finally, psychological events emerge from a complex brain-body interaction rather than just a standalone brain mechanism. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't have anything to add. But maybe one thing is that they mentioned about the replication crisis,
Ah,
right?
yeah, they said the replication crisis come from the three basic assumptions, right?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
The reason why you don't find a strong effect in this kind of, oh, this neuromechanism are activated for this particular neuropsychological event is that um, this mechanism arise from only emerge when the body is in certain state, right?
Mhm.
So when you recruit a bunch of participants in different bodily states and you average across them, then some people who are not in the right bodily state do not produce that mechanism, and then they will weaken the overall effect, something like that.
Mhm. Mm. So what do you think about their alternative assumptions?
Mm, uh, they they are reasonable, but it I don't know, if you endorse the new assumptions, how are you going to do neuroscientific studies? They made suggestions, but still, let's say you don't even have neural correlates of consciousness anymore,
Mm.
in a sense, right?
Mm.
There can be multiple neural correlates, um, and they arise from different contexts of the body and the brain.
Mm.
Uh,
Um, I yeah, basically, I agree with what the this paper says. We have implicit assumptions, so we should be aware of that when we are doing some research. I agree
mm,
with that. That's very important. Um, Also, another thing is that they kind of imply that any individuals are the same. So taking mean across participant may not
mm,
be appropriate. That's another thing.
mm.
And I agree with that. But
Yeah, there
at
are
the same time, yeah, but at the same time, as you said before, you know, how we can do, how we can investigate the brain with their, new alternative hypothesis.
mm,
That's very, yeah, I understand that, many contexts we need to include or consider not only brain, but also the brain, the cardio activity or muscular, any type of, activities, and also the environment. It's very important to consider and agree. I agree with that. So their suggestion is just collect as many or consider as many factors as possible, something like that. I think that's what they say. Because now the technology, thanks to technology, we have a lot of access to various types of data. We can use different sensors, so we should do that. And
yeah,
also the model first approach, they said,
mm,
because currently we have first hypothesis and then task design and statistical analysis. But first having computational model, we can make our assumptions clear. And then we can, rethink about the assumptions once we get some results. So having models helps us to be aware of assumptions. I agree. But at the same time, it's not always easy to have computational models, I think. Or so it's not easy.
Actually,
Yeah,
have
yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I actually have a question regarding this model first approach. I thought hypothesis testing, right? In order to test your hypothesis, when you analyze your data, don't you build a model first? Or you don't? Or they are just I know that there's another approach that has multiple different models and then see which one wins. Can explain most of the variance in the data. So what they are proposing is you propose just one computational model and then just test it instead of fishing for that one model that works.
I think their point is that, we should be aware of assumptions. Having models will be helpful in that sense. So, yeah, I think statistical analysis does not necessarily require computational models because the simplest statistical analysis, let's say t-test, A is greater than B, for example. This does not require any computational model. It's just A, measurement of A and measurement of B.
I see. It reminds me of another paper I read about how the brain processes semantic information of natural scene images. They said to analyze, the kind of brain regions relevant for certain psychological processes, you can use different either models or packages. And each of the models have very different thresholds that one model might tell you the whole brain matters, and then the other model tells you only 3 regions matter kind of situation would happen. So yeah, maybe in that sense, if you use a certain model, like you need to tell them at the beginning and then list why you think this is the most relevant here, and that will review your assumptions.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to say was that this one-to-one versus many-to-one mapping. So what this one, how precise, or for example, you can say that many different brain activity will generate the same perceptions. How same?
Yeah, I feel like in their in this section of their article, I feel like the example they give, each each brain network for the same experience, they actually correspond to a unique subtype of that experience, right? For example, for fear, they said there's this network corresponding to a pleasant type of fear, and then another network correspond to an unpleasant type of fear, and the network that involves amygdala allows you to perceive fear, and without amygdala, you may not be able to perceive fear in others, but you could still experience fear when the time comes. That kind of thing. from the phenomenological perspective, they're all different experiences. So you can still say they're one-to-one mappings.
Yeah, so that's my point. That may suggest that we may need refine the concept, and then we can, categorize these into, subgroups, and then there we should be able to find one-to-one mapping, something like that.
Yeah.
So they, as you mentioned, they gave us an example of amygdala, the fear, but yeah, fear, one concept, but different fear, different unpleasantness. So maybe we need to refine or categorize one concept into sub concept, something like that is necessary. So this one-to-one versus many-to-one, to be honest, I'm not that convinced.
Yeah.
And actually now, told me the same thing before. This, many-to-one mapping, many different brain activity. And that time I thought maybe true, but now I feel like,
It's not convincing enough in a sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's many to many, so hence one-to-one.
Yeah. And then that leads to the kind of, unsatisfaction of the first, assumption, the localization assumptions. By, they said one, mental event can be represented by distributed activity, across the whole brain. But, again, one experience can be decomposed into various different parts, and then by looking each component, we should be able to find the specific regions, the brain regions. So yeah, of course, when I see something like just a visual experience, many different brain regions activate. But at the same time, we know that, for example, neuron in V1, they are presented, for example, specific, line, the specific degree, inclined line or something like that.
Orientation?
Yeah, orientation, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
These are, I guess, localized.
Yeah, also like Jennifer Aniston concept. It does appear to show first localization and second independence to some degree.
And I guess this, localized versus whole brain argument is persist or exist this long time. So this kind of suggests that, we need to, or our brain seems to have both of them, like a localized for specific, but this whole brain works for one, mental event, or they're distributed. So I feel, the first and the second assumptions, I'm not convinced.
I see.
Yeah, the last one is, I'm totally agree. Independent assumptions. Yeah. But
I feel like the first one kind of serves as a reminder, because sometimes studies get very fixated with looking for special neural underpinnings for special psychological events, such as in consciousness, we argue whether it's the prefrontal cortex or the parietal cortex or something like that, right? So it serves as a reminder to not overlook the whole brain as well. I suppose.
Mm, I see. Mm, mm. And anything else? Mm. I don't think I have anything to say. I basically, agree what they say. I mean that we need to make our implicit assumption clear. I agree with that. So
I
if
also feel like with the independence assumption, with it dismissing the independent assumption, I feel like this also calls for, you know, data sharing and collaboration. You know, just one experiment collecting data from like 20 people may not be a good enough sample size. Instead, using those big fMRI data sets,
mm,
900 people data sets or something like that, those may be more reliable because they will include people from various geographics, health conditions, and something like that. And they
mm,
will record, the information about these people
mm,
as well. So when you analyze it, you can see whether these factors influence your results.
mm,
Whereas if you just collect data from 15 people, you actually don't get to choose and carefully control for so many things.
mm, 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 mm. So here, the important thing is that how these contextual factors, how strong they are.
Mm,
Maybe they are just, too small and we can ignore them
mm,
sometimes, but we don't know how strong they are. So the author says that we should at least correct these data and see
mm.
whether they are, they have strong effect or not. The reason why I'm saying this is that, now we are doing online experiments, right?
We are looking at the brain, but yeah,
Yeah, true. But, it's very difficult to control everything. We are
yeah,
not
true.
sure, you know, in what kind of, environment the participant doing experiment. So yeah.
Yeah, we're just trying to overcome that by like recording, like collecting data from many, many, many people. I
Mm,
guess this is specifically for addressing issues in psychophysics experiments, I
mm,
suppose, because few years ago the psychophysics experiments are still like we have a sample of 10 people or something like that. And then it doesn't get replicated because the effect in the original paper was small anyways,
mm,
kind of things.
mm, mm. So mm, yeah, I forgot to read their boxes. I think in the last boxes they listed outstanding questions. So what we need to, or what we can ask based on this study. But have you read this part?
No, I haven't got the time.
Okay, yeah. So they may discuss something we discussed here,
Ah,
maybe. Anyway, I do not have anything to add, or I don't have any questions, comment. So,
yeah, neither do I. If that's the case, then this concludes our session today. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.